Interviewees. What was something an employer said to you during an interview that made you not want to work for them? Story 1. Me. What are your actual hours? Like, if I looked at your employee sign-in, sign-out book, what would I see? Employer. Well, we work hard, but we try to be reasonable, and I glance over at the rows of desks. They're full of people. It's 7:15 p.m. Employer. We also have an office-wide conference call every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. with our main office in Adelaide. No thanks. Story 2. I interviewed for a transcriptionist job with 20 years of experience, having just moved to a new town. An older lady handed me the test tape and told me it was timed, adding that I shouldn't feel bad if I couldn't finish it all within an hour. I typed up the 5 very short and medically easy reports in about 15 minutes, including proofreading and double-checking to make sure I had them all. When I told her I was finished, she seemed flustered. Already? She asked before rushing off to confer with another older woman. They acted as if I must have cheated somehow. I left and never heard back. 6 months later, by which time I would have starved to death waiting, they called to ask if I was still interested. Nope. I interviewed at Kaiser Permanente for the same kind of job and was hired immediately at top wage based on my experience, rather than the usual starting wage most places offer. KP is a great place to work, in my opinion. Moral of the story. If someone says they have 20 years of experience and can type 120 WPM, believe them, especially if they prove it right in front of you. Story 3. I was interviewing with a large West Coast search engine company several years ago when one of the interviewers noticed my thick Southern accent and asked where I was from. I said Kentucky, and he immediately asked if it was true that a lot of people there marry their cousins, and if anyone in my family had done that. He was completely serious and wouldn't move on until I answered. I said no, and he looked at me like he didn't believe me. Super awkward. In the next interview, with that guy's boss, I was asked how my previous interviews had gone. I mentioned the remark, and the interviewer seemed very put off that I brought it up. The conversation immediately went cold. A week later, I got a call saying I wouldn't be offered the job. A month after that, they called back to ask if I was still interested. I declined. Story 4. At the in-person interview, a panel of 3 people interviewed me for an engineering position with the city. Only one of them really spoke, while the other 2 mostly sat back and listened, occasionally interjecting for minor clarifications. Question 1. Please describe the wastewater treatment process. Be as detailed as your knowledge allows. I answered in detail, mentioning that I had recently toured one of their plants and explaining the specific processes they used. Question 2. Are you familiar with insert process that I just explained? I looked at them, dumbfounded, since I had literally just described that exact process. Still, I went ahead and explained the chemistry behind it in even finer detail. Question 3. Are you familiar with the chemistry behind the process? At this point, I was 95% sure that working here would mean absolutely no freedom. Everything had to be done by the book to a ridiculous degree. I couldn't control my facial expression anymore, and it must have been obvious because the interviewers quickly apologized, explaining that they could only score me based on how I answered each question as it was asked. The rest of the interview was 45 minutes of me repeating myself. I got the job but declined. Interviewing at Freebirds, a restaurant. I was asked, "We believe there's a lot behind a name. Do you know where the name Led Zeppelin comes from?" Being a big fan of rock music, I confidently answered, "Sure, it's named ironically, because a Zeppelin is a flying machine, but a lead Zeppelin wouldn't take flight." Supervisor. Actually, Led Zeppelin was named after the gym teacher of the founding members. He didn't believe in them, and they knew they were going to be a success. Not only that, but this restaurant is named after one of their songs. Me, yeah, I thought Lynyrd Skynyrd wrote Free Bird. Supervisor, no. And I really recommend you do your research to get to know the company if we do end up offering you a position. Story 5. I went in for a bartending job at a new chain restaurant that was opening up. At that point, I had 10 years of experience, but I had also been working at my day job for about a year, the job that was actually going to be my career. Still, I wanted to keep bartending because the money was too good to completely walk away from. When I arrived, there were 2 interviewers, the GM of the new store and a hiring coordinator from their corporate office. They were interviewing the guy before me with the door open. I overheard the woman ask about his experience, and when he told her, she responded, "Well, that's not really a high-volume place. We need people who can handle high volume," before sending him on his way. Then it was my turn. We started talking, and she said, "Oh, it says here you don't want to work any weekday shifts. Why is that?" I told her I had another job, and she immediately shut it down. "We're not hiring anyone who doesn't have completely open availability." I said, "Didn't you just tell the guy before me that you needed people who can handle high volume? I've been bartending at the highest volume bar in Philadelphia for the last 10 years. You're really not going to hire me because of schedule restrictions?" She insisted they needed open availability and even asked if I'd consider leaving my other job. I laughed, literally laughed at her, and said, "Lady, I'm making $40,000 a year there, and I pretty much just started. I'm not giving that up to work lunch shifts." Then I thanked them and walked out. As I was leaving, the GM followed me outside. He told me he wanted to hire me because he knew who I was through an old co-worker of mine, and that she was just being a bitch. He said if I changed my availability on the application, he could promise I'd never be scheduled for a weekday shift. So I switched it and got the job, and he stood by his word. The funny thing? The interviewer, the one I didn't want to work for? Once the interview was over, I never saw her again. She never worked in the store at all. Story 6. The employer was a publisher. First, they explained the job, which essentially combined the full duties of a graphic artist and a web programmer, a rare skill set at the time, and I was undoubtedly one of the few people who could actually do it. Then, they went on about how marvelous the company was doing, boasting about their X billion dollars in profit from the last year, and how this meant I'd have a bright future with stability if I joined them. I thought about what they were asking, compared it to what I was already earning as a web programmer without the added graphic design duties, and decided I wouldn't even consider the job without a $30,000 raise. When we got to the discussion of salary, the number they mentioned was actually a $5,000 pay cut from what I was already making. I told them, frankly, that this was insulting and that they had no business wasting the time of top industry professionals with such a ridiculous offer. Their response: "Well, we're in the publishing industry, and publishers traditionally pay less than other employers for the same job." I asked why. They said it was because publishing is a low-profit margin industry. So I pointed out that they had some nerve trying to plead poverty after bragging about their billion-dollar profits just minutes earlier. Then I stood up and walked out. No way in hell was I ever going to work for that employer. Story 7. Interview number 1. The school that couldn't get it together. I arrived 15 minutes early for my interview at a school, only to find an empty reception area, a half-dead office plant, and a phone instructing me to call a number to announce myself. I called, spoke to a nice lady somewhere in the building, and then I waited, and waited, and waited. Half an hour past the interview time. I called again to make sure I hadn't been forgotten. Then I waited some more. 1 full hour past my scheduled interview. The phone finally rang. The message? The interviewer is unavailable. Fine. I rescheduled. I returned on a later date, this time 30 minutes early. Same empty reception area, except this time, the plant was gone. I announced myself over the phone again and waited. 15 minutes past the scheduled time, I got up and walked out. 3 hours later, I got a call asking where I was. I told them, I'm at home getting ready for work. They asked if I could reschedule again. I told them to go fuck themselves and hung up. A few days later, they actually had the audacity to send me an interview declination form. I grabbed a permanent marker and wrote across the entire thing. First interview, was told interviewer unavailable after 1 hour. Second interview, interviewer 15+ minutes late, I left. Unacceptable. 3 months later, after I had already been hired elsewhere, they called again asking if I was interested in the position. I laughed until they hung up. Interview number 2, the principal who wanted one answer only. I interviewed at another school, this time with the principal. They asked me to give 1 good quality about myself. Trying to sell myself, I gave 3. The principal immediately corrected me. I asked for 1 quality, not 3. I ended the interview right then and there. Interview number 3, the hospital with the hidden red flag. I interviewed for a hospital position and was offered the job. Only after I accepted, the interviewer let slip that the position had been vacant for some time. I took that as a huge red flag, meaning it was an expendable position, and I'd likely be the first to go at the next economic downturn. But after a year of interviewing, I took the offer anyway. I even went so far as to update my immunization records, several shots required. Before my start date, I got another job offer. The pay was lower, but the commute was much better. I took it. Since then, I've moved up within the organization and now work in a field I actually enjoy. Story 8. Fresh out of college, I applied for a developer job at a company that made advert games and edge games. This was about 10 years ago, when Flash games were huge and many companies wanted branded Flash games. The interview went great. On the way in, they showed me around the office. Nice people, interesting clients, cool projects. I made a great impression with my portfolio, and since I was the last candidate, they were impressed enough to move straight into salary and benefits negotiations, which also went smoothly. By this point, it was around 5 p.m., and they said they'd send me the paperwork for the contract. But then they added, since it's the end of the day, maybe you'd like to see how we spend our evenings at this company? Okay. They took me to a large attic space, big enough to stand in, but with no windows. On one side, there were logs, actual tree trunks, placed around a fake campfire. On the other side, tents. Proper camping tents with sleeping bags and everything. Then they asked if I played any instruments because every night, the whole team came up there, played music around the fake campfire while they had dinner, then went back to work for a few more hours before sleeping in the tents, so they could start early the next morning. Most people, apparently, only went home on weekends. I was so absolutely stunned that I didn't even decline the job on the spot. I just thanked them for the interview, got on the train home, and sat there, mulling it over. The next day, I declined over the phone, and the manager actually got mad because he had already accepted a job from a client and scheduled me on it. Story 9. I used to work in management for a financial firm and was looking for a lateral move within the company. I had lined up a few interviews, all of which followed the same structure. First, a meeting with 2 team managers, then an interview with the VP. Each interviewer would ask a series of 6 random questions from a 3-part interview packet. My last interview was at a different site than my own. I arrived early and went to the location I was told to be at. The problem? They had given me a room that was actually a massive call center with over 500 cubicles, and I had no clue who I was supposed to meet. I wandered through the aisles of cubicles until I found one labeled admin. The admin had no idea about the interview. After 15 minutes of her trying to figure out what was going on, while I showed her the email from the VP confirming the interview, she just sent me to a conference room. I waited another 20 minutes before the first manager came in. She rushed through the 6 questions and told me she'd get the second manager. I offered her my resume, as is standard practice, but she wasn't interested. The second manager showed up almost 40 minutes later and thought she was the first interviewer. She started asking me the exact same 6 questions. After the first one, I told her I had already answered section 1 of the packet. I offered her my resume again, expecting to reference it for the next section. She refused to even acknowledge it. At this point, I was ready to walk out, but since the VP had scheduled the interview, I figured I'd at least thank them for the opportunity. Then, instead of the VP, a third manager showed up 20 minutes later and asked me the same 6 damn questions. Once again, I told them I had already answered them. This time, they took my resume, saying they'd give it to the VP, but that he was too busy to do the interview today. By now, I had already decided I wouldn't take the job in what was clearly a train wreck of a department, so I asked, why does it feel like this interview is wasting everyone's time? She just shrugged and said, if you get the job, you better get used to this. He's unorganized and never communicates anything to anyone. No one communicates around here, but you get used to it. I smiled and said, thank you for the opportunity, but I'd rather not get used to it. I'm officially withdrawing my application. Story 10. I recently had an interview that raised red flags everywhere. The person interviewing me was the head of this 40-person company, a pudgy man in his late 50s. We went into his office, where a senior analyst, who happened to be female, was already waiting for us. I mention this for a reason. She asked me some technical questions, which I answered without any issue, as expected, since they weren't doing anything I hadn't done before. Then he started his round of questioning. Red flag number 1. Even though I have 10+ years of experience in data analysis, he kept harping on my lack of experience in the healthcare data field. I explained that I wanted to get into healthcare because it's a growing industry and gave all the standard but correct answers to those kinds of questions. He just wouldn't let it go. At that point, I was sitting there thinking, if my lack of healthcare data experience is such a big problem, why even bother interviewing me? Then, He went on about how he wanted people with a passion for the field, and I was just thinking, how many people in healthcare data analysis are truly passionate about their field, especially considering what they were offering? It was just a small healthcare information company with average pay, average benefits, and no real perks. It wasn't like I was applying to Google or some top-tier company. Red flag number 2. Every time I answered a question, he would say, "Well, what if XXXX occurred?" Sometimes, he even cut me off mid-answer to change the scenario. I'd respond logically, "Well, that changes the scenario. So instead of doing Y like I previously said, I would do X instead." It just felt weird, like he didn't actually want me to answer anything correctly. If I gave a correct answer, he'd change the scenario to make my first answer wrong. The final red flag. As he was walking me out, he asked if I wanted a tour of the office. The work area was a big open space with half-height cubicles where the analysts worked. The senior analyst who had asked me technical questions was sitting in the cube farm. There were a few offices and conference rooms, but I could see at least 35 of the 45 employees working there. The weird part, every single one of them was a woman. Not most, not a majority. Every single one. Other than the boss, I did not see another man in the entire office. Now, I have zero problem working for or with women. But at that moment, everything clicked. This guy didn't want me there. I was the token male interview, so he could claim he wasn't intentionally hiring only women. I already knew I wasn't going to get an offer. But even if I did, there was no way I would have taken the job. Even if I were the perfect employee, if any of the women gave me the slightest amount of attention, even just work-related, it would have driven him crazy and created a horrible work environment. A couple of days later, I got an email saying they were going in a different direction. I have never been so happy to get a rejection letter. Story 11. For me, it wasn't just one thing. It was a series of events that led me to decide I didn't want the job. But what the interviewer finally said was definitely the last straw. I was applying for a job at Walmart in my hometown during my senior year of high school. Suburbs, 50K people. They had some customer experience testing that I completed on the computer beforehand. I wanted money. Not that it really mattered, since my family was poor and most of it would end up going to them anyway, but I just wanted to be able to go out and do shit like any normal teenager. My interview was scheduled, and my sister gave me a ride to Walmart. When I got there, I went to the returns area, since I hadn't been told where to go. I asked where they held interviews, and they told me to wait in the automotive section. Someone would come get me. 30 to 45 minutes passed. I stood around the paint and auto section, waiting. Meanwhile, I noticed the workers all looked like they wanted to kill themselves, which was pretty off-putting, but I brushed it off. Eventually, I went back up to the returns desk to ask when someone was actually coming to get me. Again, they told me to go wait in the auto section, and someone would be there soon. At this point, I was getting impatient, but I figured I'd try to be patient and wait. Another 30 to 45 minutes passed. Finally, a worker noticed me pacing around the auto section for what felt like an eternity. They asked if I was waiting for someone. I explained my situation, and they told someone. Another 20 to 30 minutes passed. By now, I was seriously considering just leaving. I told myself, if they don't come grab me in the next 10 minutes, I'm walking out. Right as the clock was about to hit that cutoff, they finally called me in. At this point, I was internally screaming and so done with this process. I got into the interview room, where I was met by a worker and a manager, or at least someone who looked like one. Then, I waited another 15 minutes while they struggled to find my file. When they finally found it, turns out, some other chick had come in earlier for an interview, and some absolute dumbass had assigned us the same number. So, in their system, it looked like my interview had already been completed, because the other person's interview had been recorded under my name. The manager, whose skin looked like leather, turned around and said, "Well, I guess we'll have to reschedule this first interview so we can fix this." I literally wanted to get out of my chair, smack them WWE style, and hit these motherfuckers with the people's elbow. Instead, I just walked out and never showed up for the rescheduled interview. Story 12. I flew to the city from my hometown to interview for a specific job in the defense industry with a large security company. The job I was interested in was about 20 minutes from my mother's house, where I planned to stay if I got it. It also had a very appealing permanent roster and working hours. Before making the trip, I had spent a good half an hour talking over the phone with a company manager who talked me into taking time off from my current job and flying down for the interview. After making it through the group interview and aptitude tests, I was brought in for my one-on-one interview. I walked in, and the guy behind the desk didn't even look up at me before saying, "Well, we're going to need you to start tomorrow at the airport. Is that a problem?" I took a second to process that, then replied, "Hi, I'm Name, nice to meet you. I'm actually here to interview for the job at Base Name on the defense contract." Him, "Your experience is all in airport security. Why would I put you on a defense job?" Me, "I'm interviewing for this job because I wanted a change of scenery and the chance to expand my skill set. I only flew here for this interview because I was told there were positions available at that site." Him, "Well, beggars can't be choosers. You want to pay your bills or not?" Me, I'm still employed by other security company, and they pay me double the hourly rate your company offers for airport guards. If I wanted to keep working at an airport, I'd do it for them. I'm here because I want to move to the city and experience something my hometown doesn't have to offer. If you can't offer me a position at Base Name, then I'll have to thank you for your time and excuse myself." Him, grumbling, "Well, all right. Go to the room down the hall, and they'll give you the defense pack to fill out for your security clearance." Me, "Thank you. Was there anything else you wanted to ask me?" Him, "No." Me, "All right, it was nice to meet you." Him, "Sean." He didn't shake my hand, and I left, seriously questioning if I wanted to work for a company with such a prick for an HR guy. Luckily, after taking the position, I never had to deal with him again. In the early 2000s, I answered a newspaper ad promising, "Be your own boss. Make your own hours. Travel and get paid." I was 16. Of course, I wanted to be my own boss. The office was creepy as hell right from the start, and the guy running it looked like a caricature of a 1970s used car salesman. It was a mass interview setup, about 9 people in total. We were told to sign here, date here, sit there. Then he'd call our names one by one. When my turn came, he launched into a sales pitch about all the money I'd be making, how easy the job was, and how I could move up if I was dedicated. But every time I asked him what the job actually was, he dodged the question, over and over. Finally, he told me he couldn't tell me what the company actually did until the 3rd interview. At 16, I was almost 100% sure I was about to accidentally join a cult. I bluntly told him what I thought about the whole thing and walked out. Turns out, it was one of those pyramid schemes where you had to buy $600 worth of kitchen knife sets up front to get started. Then, the guy drives you around in a creepy van all day, trying to sell knives to housewives and old ladies in mall parking lots, or convince your friends to be their own boss and buy sets too. Instead, I ended up getting a job as a backhoe operator for one of the most honest, hardworking, and all-around best dudes I've ever met. He taught me a lot about skill sets and work ethic, things that, 10 years later, helped me land my dream career. Story 13. I had an interview with a man and a woman for a job that didn't even exist yet. They still had to create it. They couldn't tell me anything about the job because they were still in the process of setting everything up. When it was my turn to ask questions, they couldn't answer anything. Me, "What would a regular day at work look like?" Them, "We have no idea. We're still setting everything up, so we don't know yet." Me, "Okay. What kind of people would I be working with?" Them, "Well, we're still setting up a team, so we can't tell you what kind of people are going to be your colleagues." Me, "Will there be opportunities for growth? Would I be offered any education or training?" Them, "Well, we're not sure. You'll be able to learn on the job, but offering education would have to be considered by HQ." Despite all this, it still sounded like an interesting opportunity, and since these people were new, I thought we could at least learn from each other. They told me they'd call back, so I waited 2 weeks. Nothing. I called them myself, only to be told that they weren't hiring anymore because they had decided to go in a different direction. This was a major international company. Unbelievable. Story 14. I went to an interview at a company where a high school friend was working. Out of nowhere, this guy called me up and asked if I wanted a job. I thought, maybe this is just good luck, and decided to check it out. I was skeptical because we were only 2 years out of high school, and here he was, working in an office, wearing full suits every day like an investment banker or something. This guy was not an overachiever. In fact, he regularly copied off me in any class we shared, so I figured he must have completely changed his life to land a job like this so soon after graduation. Since I mentioned my skepticism, my mom came along, just to make sure it wasn't some sketchy setup, protective mother instincts in full force. We waited by the front desk, and right away, things felt off. The office was tiny and barren, straight up empty. You know that Trump press conference where they had empty folders stacked up to make it look like something was going on? That's exactly what this place looked like. While we were waiting, I took a closer look at the piles of paper near the door, completely blank. Finally, this guy comes out. Looks young as hell, maybe 2 years older than me at most. He's wearing a full suit and seems to be the only person there. He shakes my hand, greets my mom, and then does something weird as hell. He asks her to come into the interview with us. The interview. It wasn't even an interview. He asked me one question. Do you know what a 401k is? I told him I was familiar with the concept, but I hadn't really learned about it in depth. Instead of talking about the job, he launched into a full sales pitch to my mom about what the company does. Something about helping with savings, using some mathematical equation, and asking her if she wanted to enroll. She desperately tried to steer the conversation back to me, while I just sat there, watching this disaster unfold. Then, mid-sentence, he stopped, looked at me, and said, "So we'd love to have you. Here's a flyer explaining our training packages. Call me back and let us know if you're interested." We got back in the car, and all I could say was, "What the fuck just happened?" My mom just sighed and said, "You said your friend never really did well in school, right?" "Yeah, why?" "That explains why he's gullible enough to fall for a pyramid scheme." Story 15. I interviewed for a digital marketing role about a year ago and ended up sitting across from an absolute sociopath. He spent half the interview berating my A-level grades, exams taken at 17, 18, which were actually pretty good, while completely ignoring my extensive industry experience and education, all because he used to teach business management. LOL. The assistant manager, who was actually very nice, looked mortified the entire time. Despite this, I felt I held my own and gave a strong interview. Looking back, there's no way I would tolerate shitty comments from that sniveling creep now, but at the time, my contract was coming to an end, and I was desperate for a permanent role. Then, 10 minutes after the interview, he called me to ask about a gap in the education section of my CV. I explained that I had initially enrolled in one university course, realized it had been mis-sold to me, cut my losses, and switched to a much better course, securing employment in between. He asked for full details of the initial course, my stopgap employment, and references. This was for waitressing work from 7 years prior. There's a reason it wasn't on my CV. Shortly after, he followed up with an email saying he was most disappointed that I hadn't disclosed this in the interview. He claimed I had ample opportunity to address my mistakes and that he was still considering me, but left it a few days before not offering me the job, as if I would have taken it. I thanked him for his email and responded. I was in complete agreement that the job wasn't for me. It was unfortunate that my immediately supplied supplementary information wasn't satisfactory, despite offering to address any concerns at the interview. I hadn't brought up my past university decision in the interview, not because it was a mistake, but because waitressing had zero relevance to a digital marketing role. Not only did I get offered a job with nearly double the salary shortly after, I also poached one of his clients before even starting my new role. Story 16. This is my time to shine. I had an interview last week at a pharmacy for what I assumed would be a job as a pharmacy assistant. First red flag, the interviewer, who was also the owner and head pharmacist, was wearing flip-flops. A little odd. Then she kept me waiting for 15 minutes. Normally, not a big deal, but in that time, she served one customer and called me Melissa. My name is Madeline, or Maddie. The interview itself, conducted behind the counter, with staff and customers listening in. She sat on a stool, had me stand, kicked off her flip-flops, and this time, called me Melanie. She asked the usual interview questions. How did you find this job? And what would you bring to this workplace? Now, I like to think I'm a personable gal, so I replied. I would bring excellent customer service to our customers, a friendly and positive attitude, a willingness to learn, and a passion for pharmacy and health in general. Her response? Sorry, not good enough. I was a little taken aback. I wasn't sure where she was going with this, so I added, dedication to our customers, loyalty to the store and staff, helpfulness, and initiative. Still not good enough. This time, she called me Melinda. At this point, she stopped talking about pharmacy work altogether and instead focused on my massage therapy qualifications. Turns out, she wasn't looking for a pharmacy assistant. She wanted me to work as a massage therapist. If I wanted to be a massage therapist, I would be pursuing that. She planned to charge $60 an hour for my massages, but only pay me a pharmacy assistant's wage, around $17 an hour. So, basically, she wanted to rip me off, pocket the extra money, and lie to the tax department by employing me as a pharmacy assistant while having me work as a massage therapist. Then came the most insane part. She said I would need to give her a massage so she could confirm I knew what I was doing. Because apparently, she, a pharmacist, not a trained massage therapist, would know whether I had proper training just by how it felt. I explained why I wasn't pursuing massage therapy full-time. Since I wasn't trained in remedial massage, customers couldn't get a healthcare rebate, which meant they could go somewhere else, use their health cover, and only pay $10 instead. She insisted I was wrong, even after I told her that 98% of potential clients had wanted the rebate. She kept telling me I was lying and making it up. Somehow, through all of that, I agreed to a trial day a few days later. The interview ended. She walked me out in front of customers, barefoot, and this time, she called me Madison, which, I guess, was slightly closer. I corrected her each time, by the way. I got in my car thinking, what the fuck just happened? I got home and started figuring out how to back out of the trial shift when, later that night, I got a call from the other pharmacist saying, "Thank you for your interest, but the position has been filled." Safe to say, I was relieved, since now, I never had to go back to whatever that shit show was. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, activate the notification bell, and share a similar story or anything you'd like to say in the comments. See you next time.